Ma'am, with all due respect, this is a live-fire range for active component trainees, not a sightseeing tour for Pentagon auditors. The heat, the noise, the recoil. It can be a bit overwhelming for the uninitiated. The words, slick with condescending sweetness, slid from Staff Sergeant Cole, Rhino, Evans's mouth and hung in the thick, shimmering air of the Desert Training Center. The crowd of young, eager recruits, all bravado and nervous energy, snickered. They saw what he saw, a woman in her late 40s, her uniform crisp but unremarkable, her hair streaked with a quiet gray and pulled back in a severe regulation bun. She held a data pad, her posture one of serene observation, a stark contrast to the coiled tension of everyone else on the firing line. She was an observer, a bureaucrat, a check in the box from some higher, irrelevant echelon, sent to ensure their training met some new, pointless standard. She was a ghost at their feast of gunpowder and steel. But when Colonel Bishop, watching from the cool shadow of the observation tower through his stabilized binoculars, saw her stance, he didn't see an auditor. He saw something else entirely. He saw the subtle, almost imperceptible shift of her weight onto the balls of her feet. The way her eyes didn't just look but scanned, cataloging the wind currents in the swaying salt cedars and the heat mirage dancing over the distant steel targets. He saw a stillness that was not passive but predatory. The recruits laughed, their chests puffed out, echoing the casual arrogance of their instructor. The woman, Master Sergeant Evelyn Reed, offered no reaction. Her focus remained unbroken, her expression as placid and unreadable as the vast desert sky above. Her silence was a canvas, and on it, Staff Sergeant Evans painted a masterpiece of his own ignorance. He mistook her calm for weakness, her silence for intimidation, her professionalism for fragility. It was an assumption that would soon be dismantled piece by piece with the cold, irrefutable logic of a single, perfectly placed round. A legend was not about to be witnessed. It was about to be forged in the crucible of his disrespect, and its echo would reshape the very soul of the institution he claimed to represent. If you believe that true competence needs no introduction and that respect is earned in the silence between heartbeats, type competence below. For what was about to unfold on Range 7 was not merely a lesson in marksmanship, but a profound and lasting sermon on the quiet authority of demonstrated excellence, a truth that would be etched into the memory of every person present, a permanent scar on the landscape of their assumptions. The value of a warrior was not measured in the volume of their voice, but in the precision of their actions. A reality Staff Sergeant Evans and his cohort of believers were about to learn in the most humbling and public way imaginable. His world, built on the flimsy scaffolding of superficial judgment, was poised on the brink of a complete and total collapse, and the architect of its demolition was the very person he had so carelessly dismissed. The desert held its breath, waiting for the quiet professional to finally and irrevocably answer. Staff Sergeant Evans, emboldened by the laughter of his charges and the woman's continued silence, continued his performance. He strode back and forth along the firing line, his boots crunching on the gravel with theatrical importance. He was the master of this domain, a small kingdom of dust and discipline, and this unexpected visitor was an affront to his sovereignty. You see, ma'am, he continued, projecting his voice so everyone could hear, out here, we deal in results. Tangible, measurable results. Not paperwork. Not theories from a climate-controlled office in Virginia. We measure success in fractions of an inch at 1,000 yards. We measure it in groups, so tight you can cover them with a quarter. We measure it by the standard set on this very range, a standard that has stood untouched for 10 years. He gestured dramatically toward a large, sun-faded wooden sign hammered into the ground near the firing positions. On it, painted in stark, black letters, were the words, "The Gauntlet, Record Holder, GSGTM, Thorn, 5/5, 103-2014. The recruits looked at the sign with a mixture of awe and reverence. The Gauntlet was the stuff of legends, a final test for only the most elite marksmen to graduate the course. It wasn't just a qualification, it was an ascension. 5 shots, each more improbable than the last, at extreme distances with variable winds and challenging positions. A perfect score was mythical. It had been achieved only once, by a near-mythical figure himself, Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Thorne, a man whose name was spoken in hushed tones in the barracks long after he had left service. Evans had been a raw recruit when Thorne set that record, and he had modeled his entire career on the man's aggressive, confident style. 10 years, Evans repeated, letting the weight of the time settle over the crowd. A decade of the best shooters this branch has to offer, trying and failing to match it. They come here, full of confidence, and the desert humbles them. The wind humbles them. The math humbles them. It's a testament to a real warrior, ma'am. Someone who did the work, who lived and breathed this life, not just observed it. The insult was clear, a direct and public challenge to her legitimacy. Master Sergeant Reed simply made a small notation on her datapad, her movements economical and precise. Her lack of response seemed to infuriate Evans even more. His confidence, it seemed, required an audience and an adversary. Her refusal to be the latter was a quiet denial of his power. He saw her composure not as the discipline of a professional, but as the aloof disinterest of a bureaucrat. He couldn't comprehend a confidence so deep that it required no external validation. He needed to break it. "Tell you what," he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes, "why don't you come take a closer look? Get a feel for the equipment. I can even have one of the recruits explain how the scope works." The offer dripped with sarcasm, another performance for his audience. He was inviting her into his world solely to prove she didn't belong. He was handing her a shovel, expecting her to dig her own grave of embarrassment. And Evelyn Reed, with a quiet sigh that was less about weariness and more about a deep, abiding patience, finally looked up from her datapad, her eyes meeting his for the first time. She gave a single, slow nod. It was not a gesture of acceptance, but of acknowledgement. She had heard him. She had seen him. And now, the performance would end, and the lesson would begin. The wind, which had been a fickle but manageable breeze all morning, suddenly shifted. A powerful gust swept down from the surrounding mesas, kicking up a blinding sheet of sand and forcing the recruits to shield their eyes. The wind socks on the range, previously lolling, now snapped to attention, stretched taut and horizontal. The distant flags marking wind direction and speed began to whip violently, their movements chaotic and unpredictable. Staff Sergeant Evans looked out at the range, a grim satisfaction on his face. "All right, listen up," he barked, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind. "Conditions have just gone from difficult to damn near impossible. This is what separates the shooter from the theorist. This is where the math gets real. The record was set on a day just like this. It's a perfect day to demonstrate why legends are legends." He was turning the challenge of nature into another prop for his lecture. He intended to have his best recruit attempt the gauntlet and fail, proving his point about the difficulty and the untouchable nature of the record. But as he turned to select his champion, he saw that Master Sergeant Reed was no longer standing with her datapad. She had placed it carefully on an empty gear case and was walking with a calm, unhurried gait toward the equipment racks. The recruits parted before her, their smirks fading into expressions of confused curiosity. She bypassed the new, state-of-the-art sniper systems, the ones with advanced optics and integrated ballistic computers that the recruits fawned over. Her eyes scanned the rack until they settled on a rifle case at the very end, covered in a thin layer of dust, clearly set aside and unused. It was older, its latches worn, its surface covered in the scars of long and hard use. She unclipped the latches and opened the case. Inside, nestled in worn foam, was an M210 enhanced sniper rifle, but one that was clearly heavily customized. The stock was worn smooth in the places a cheek and a hand would rest, its synthetic material almost taking on the character of polished wood. The barrel was free-floating, and the scope mounted on it was a powerful but older model, its adjustment turrets larger and more pronounced than the modern digital ones. Evans recognized it immediately, and a flicker of confusion crossed his face. It was one of the range's reserve rifles, a relic from a previous generation of equipment, kept more for sentimental reasons than for practical use. It was, in fact, Thorne's old training rifle. Without a word, Reed lifted the rifle from its case. The movement was fluid, a single, practiced motion that spoke of 1,000 repetitions. She didn't just hold it. She balanced it, her hands finding their natural purchase on the stock and grip as if they were extensions of her own body. She moved to the designated firing position for the gauntlet, position 5, the Thorne Reed line in a future none of them could yet imagine. She laid down a worn shooting mat, its canvas faded by the sun of 100 different ranges. Every action was deliberate, devoid of any wasted motion. She checked the rifle's action. She attached the bipod. She removed the lens caps from the scope. There was a rhythmic quality to her preparation, a silent cadence of competence that began to drain the noise and arrogance from the air. The recruits were no longer watching their instructor. They were utterly captivated by her. This wasn't the fumbling of a novice. This was the quiet ritual of a master. Her silence was no longer passive. It was deeply, profoundly active, a state of intense concentration that seemed to bend the chaotic environment to her will. She was not preparing to shoot. She was preparing to speak in the only language that mattered on this range, the only language that could not be misconstrued, the universal, undeniable language of pure precision. She settled in behind the rifle, her body conforming to the earth as if she were a part of the landscape itself. The wind tore at her uniform, but she remained a statue of placid focus. Her breathing slowed, each inhale and exhale a measured, controlled process, a conscious lowering of her heart rate. She was not fighting the conditions. She was joining them, listening to them. Her left eye closed, and her right eye looked through the scope, not just at the target, but at the entire world between her and it. She watched the mirage, the heat waves rising from the desert floor, reading their subtle dance to understand the shifting currents of the wind. For a full minute, she did nothing but watch and breathe, a portrait of absolute calm amidst the manufactured tension and natural chaos. The first target was a standard silhouette at 800 yards, a difficult but achievable shot for a trained sniper on a calm day. On a day like this, with the wind gusting unpredictably from two different directions, it was a shot of pure faith and complex calculation. Evans stood with his arms crossed, a smug look returning to his face. She was putting on a good show, but this was where the fantasy would meet the brutal reality of physics. He expected her to fire and miss, a loud declaration of her failure. But the silence stretched. Then, with a smoothness that seemed to defy mechanics, her finger tightened on the trigger. The rifle didn't roar. It cracked, a single, sharp report that split the air. The sound was immediately followed by a faint, almost musical ping that echoed back from the distant target. A perfect center mass hit. The recruits gasped as one. Evans's smug expression faltered. A lucky shot, he told himself. A complete fluke. The second target was smaller, a 12-inch circular plate at 1,000 yards, partially obscured by a simulated piece of cover, leaving only a small crescent visible. Reed ejected the spent casing with a flick of her wrist, the brass shell spinning through the air in a perfect arc. She didn't pause to admire her first shot. Her focus was already downrange. She made a minute adjustment to her scope, a barely perceptible click of the windage knob. Again, she waited, reading the wind, becoming one with the rifle. The second crack echoed across the range, and an instant later, the distant plate rang out, spinning wildly on its post. Another perfect hit. The murmuring among the recruits grew louder. This was not luck. This was something else. Evans's face had gone from confident to concerned. The third shot was the heart of the gauntlet's legend. A hostage target at 1,250 yards. Two silhouettes, one layered in front of the other. The shot required the bullet to pass through a 3-inch circle on the hostage-taker target without touching the hostage silhouette directly behind it. It was a shot that tested not just marksmanship, but a sniper's moral clarity and absolute confidence. It was the shot that had broken the spirit of 100 expert marksmen. Reed took a deeper breath. She adjusted her position slightly, canting the rifle to compensate for spin drift and the Coriolis effect. The world seemed to shrink to the narrow tube of her scope. The wind, the dust, the onlookers, they all ceased to exist. There was only her, the rifle, and the impossible problem downrange. The third shot was the loudest yet, a crisp thunderclap that seemed to silence the wind itself. For a heart-stopping second, there was no sound from the target. Then, the report came back. Not a ping, but the solid, definitive thwack of the bullet striking the rear target, followed by the sight of it falling backward. The hostage target in front remained untouched, a silent testament to an impossible feat. The fourth and fifth targets, at 1,400 and 1,500 yards respectively, were almost an epilogue. 2 more shots, 2 more cracks, 2 more pings echoing back across the stunned silence. 5 shots, 5 perfect hits. The gauntlet was not just completed, it was conquered. Master Sergeant Evelyn Reed pushed herself up from the ground, her movements just as calm and methodical as they had been when she started. She ejected the final casing and cleared the weapon. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a physical presence, heavier than the desert heat, louder than the howling wind. It was the sound of a decade-old legend being shattered. It was the sound of every arrogant assumption turning to dust. It was the sound of a world being remade. Staff Sergeant Evans stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated disbelief. He uttered 2 words, a hoarse whisper that was swallowed by the immense silence. No way. The spell of silence was broken by the crunch of heavy boots on gravel, deliberate and authoritative. Every head turned. Colonel Bishop was descending from the observation tower, his face set like granite. He walked not toward Staff Sergeant Evans, who looked as if he'd been struck by lightning, but directly toward the firing line, his path straight and purposeful. The recruits, who had been gaping at the distant, fallen targets, snapped to attention as he approached, their spines straightening, their eyes locked forward. All except one. Master Sergeant Reed was methodically cleaning the M210, her focus entirely on the tool in her hands, her back to the approaching base commander. She ran a cleaning rod down the barrel with a practiced, rhythmic motion, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of the moment she had just created. Her work was done. Now came the tidying up. It was the simple, unglamorous, professional end to a spectacular act. Colonel Bishop stopped directly behind her. He didn't speak for a long moment, simply observing the calm efficiency of her movements. The tension on the range was palpable. The recruits were barely breathing. They, along with Staff Sergeant Evans, were braced for an explosion, a reckoning for the gross insubordination and the public humiliation of an NCO. But when the colonel finally spoke, his voice was quiet, devoid of anger, and filled with a tone that no one present had ever heard him use before. It was a tone of profound, almost reverent respect. "That's Eleanor, isn't it?" he asked, his voice just loud enough for Reed to hear. Reed paused her cleaning, her hands stilling on the rifle. She didn't turn around. "Yes, sir," she said, her own voice calm and even. "I haven't seen her in 15 years, Bishop said, a note of nostalgia in his voice. "Not since Thorne used her to win the all-branch championships at Lejeune. He always said she had a soul, said she'd only shoot true for someone who understood her." He took a step closer, his eyes tracing the worn lines of the rifle stock. "He would be proud to know she's still in good hands." He then straightened up, his demeanor shifting back from personal to professional. He turned his head and locked his gaze on a young lieutenant who served as his aide. The quiet respect in his voice was gone, replaced by the cold, hard steel of command. "Lieutenant, get me Master Sergeant Reed's file. Her full file. Unredacted. I want it on my tablet." Now the lieutenant, startled by the intensity of the order, simply stammered, "Yes, sir," and practically sprinted toward the command vehicle. Colonel Bishop turned his attention back to the range, his eyes sweeping over the stunned faces of the recruits and finally landing, with immense weight, on Staff Sergeant Evans. Evans flinched as if physically struck. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain, to apologize, but the colonel cut him off with a subtle shake of his head. No excuses. No explanations. Only the coming truth. The wait for the lieutenant's return was excruciating. The wind howled, the only sound in a world that had become a silent courtroom. The recruits stood like statues. Evans looked at the ground, the desert sand at his feet, suddenly the most interesting thing in the world. And Master Sergeant Evelyn Reed finished cleaning the rifle, placed it carefully back in its case, and closed the lid with a soft, final click. She was an auditor, after all, and the audit was complete. The lieutenant returned, jogging back across the gravel, his face pale. He held out a military-grade tablet, the screen already lit. Colonel Bishop took it without a word and turned his back on the firing line, creating a small zone of privacy, though his voice would soon carry to every corner of the range. He tapped the screen, his fingers scrolling through pages of digital text that represented a life lived in the shadows. For a moment, he was silent, reading. The recruits fidgeted. Staff Sergeant Evans swallowed hard, his throat dry. Then, the colonel turned around, his face a mask of cold fury and deep disappointment. He held up the tablet so that Evans could see the screen, though the text was too small to read from that distance. It was a symbolic gesture. This was the evidence. This was the verdict. Staff Sergeant Evans, the colonel began, his voice dangerously calm. You pride yourself on results, on tangible, measurable data. So let's look at some data. He tapped the screen. Let's start with Unit. Master Sergeant Reed's current assignment is listed as Training and Doctrine Command Liaison and Observer. An auditor. That's what you saw. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. But what you failed to see, what your arrogance blinded you to, is her primary designation. Unit, United States Army Special Operations Command, Special Activities Division. He looked up from the tablet, his eyes boring into Evans. Do you know what that is, Staff Sergeant? Evans shook his head, mute. No, you don't. Because officially, it doesn't exist. It's a ghost designation for Tier 1 assets who operate in places we can't admit we are, doing things we can't admit we do. She isn't an observer of the standard, Staff Sergeant. She is the standard. He tapped the screen again. Let's move on to awards. I see a few here. A Distinguished Service Cross for an action in the Hindu Kush. The details, of course, are classified, but the citation mentions unwavering precision under direct enemy fire, resulting in the neutralization of a high-value target and the saving of her entire team. I also see a Silver Star Weiss. And a Bronze Star with V for Valor 5 times. The recruits' eyes were wide with disbelief. They were in the presence not just of a master sergeant, but of a decorated war hero, a living legend. In qualifications, the colonel continued, his voice dripping with ice. Master Instructor, Special Forces Sniper Course. Senior Instructor, Long-Range Interdiction and Reconnaissance. She didn't just take the course you're teaching, Staff Sergeant. She wrote the book, the real book, the classified annex that you don't even have the clearance to read. The techniques you teach as gospel are the simplified versions of the doctrines she developed 10 years ago. The final blow was yet to come. And this rifle, Bishop said, gesturing to the case at Reed's feet. Eleanor, you were right about one thing. It belonged to Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Thorne, the man who set the record you hold so sacred. He was her spotter for 8 years. They were a team. When he was killed in action in the Karangal Valley, he willed it to her. She didn't just break his record, Staff Sergeant. She honored his legacy. The colonel lowered the tablet. He took a step toward Master Sergeant Reed, who had finally stood up and was watching him with her placid, unreadable expression. He stopped before her, drew himself up to his full height, and rendered a slow, perfect formal salute. It was a gesture of immense, profound respect from a full colonel to a non-commissioned officer, a public reversal of the hierarchy of rank in deference to the hierarchy of skill. Ma'am, he said, his voice clear and strong for all to hear. It is an honor to have you on my base. That night, the story didn't just spread, it detonated. It moved through the barracks with the speed of a shockwave, passed and hushed, reverent whispers between bunk beds long after lights out. The recruits who had been there retold it with the fervor of apostles, their descriptions growing more mythic with each telling. They no longer called her the auditor or the old lady. They gave her a new name, one befitting the impossible thing they had witnessed. They called her the Ghost of Range 7. The story jumped the fences of the base. It found its way onto the unofficial military forums and encrypted chat groups where soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines trade gossip and legends. An anonymous user, likely one of the recruits on a contraband phone, posted a thread titled, "You guys will not believe what happened at the Fort Ellison Sniper Course today." The post was crude and full of typos, but its core message was electric. It described a quiet, gray-haired master sergeant who had been mocked by a loudmouth instructor, only to pick up a 10-year-old rifle and shatter a legendary range record in hurricane force winds. The replies came in a flood. At first, there was skepticism. Pics, or it didn't happen, sounds like a barracks lawyer fantasy. But then, other users from the base began to corroborate the details. A supply sergeant confirmed an old M210 had been signed out. An officer from the command tower mentioned the colonel had spent the afternoon on Range 7. Slowly, the digital tide turned from disbelief to awe. The legend began to solidify. The instructor's lounge, usually a place of loud jokes and camaraderie, was morgue-like the next morning. Staff Sergeant Evans sat alone, stirring a cup of coffee, his face pale and drawn. His colleagues gave him a wide berth, not out of anger, but out of a shared sense of shame. They had all been complicit, laughing along with his jokes, sharing his assumptions. They all saw a reflection of their own potential ignorance in his public downfall. The culture of the base began to subtly shift. A new sense of caution settled over the training fields. Instructors were a little slower to judge, a little quicker to listen. A recruit question was met with a thoughtful answer instead of a sarcastic dismissal. The incident on Range 7 had served as a powerful, institutional corrective. It was a reminder that the most unassuming package can contain the most formidable weapon, that a quiet demeanor can hide a will of iron, and that the true measure of a warrior is not found on their sleeve or their collar, but in the silent, undeniable proof of their competence. The Ghost of Range 7 had done more than just shoot 5 targets. She had recalibrated the moral compass of an entire generation of new soldiers, teaching them a lesson that no training manual could ever hope to convey. Staff Sergeant Cole Evans did not sleep that night. He lay awake in his bunk, the colonel's words echoing in his mind, each one a fresh wave of humiliation. She wrote the book. She is the standard. She honored his legacy. He saw her face, calm and impassive, as he had mocked her. He felt the phantom weight of every recruit's eyes on him, first with amusement, then with shock, and finally with a pity that was worse than any scorn. He was not just an arrogant fool. He was a gatekeeper who had tried to bar the door to a legend. He had stood on the shoulders of a giant like Marcus Thorne to make himself feel tall, only to discover the woman he insulted stood far taller, on a mountain of experience he couldn't even comprehend. Sometime before dawn, he got up. He went to the small office he used as the range master and pulled out his copy of the Advanced Marksmanship Doctrine. He flipped through the pages he thought he knew by heart. He saw them now with new eyes, recognizing the sparse, economical language, the focus on fundamentals over flair, the quiet confidence in the text. He saw her in the words. The next morning, he found her. She wasn't in the VIP quarters or meeting with the base command. She was back on Range 7, alone, calibrating the scope of a recruit's rifle. She was mentoring, teaching, doing the quiet, necessary work that builds an army. Evans approached slowly, his boots scuffing in the dirt. He felt as if he were walking toward a tribunal. She didn't look up as he approached. Her attention focused on the minute clicks of the turret. He stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over her. He stood there for a full minute, wrestling with the words, the pride and shame warring within him. Finally, he spoke, his voice hoarse and unfamiliar to his own ears. "Master Sergeant," he began, and then faltered. He cleared his throat. "Master Sergeant Reed, I wanted to apologize. For my conduct yesterday." She paused her work, but still did not look at him. She was listening. "There's no excuse for it," he continued, the words coming in a rush. My behavior was unprofessional. My assumptions were ignorant. I was arrogant, and I was wrong. I disrespected you. I disrespected the uniform, and I disrespected the memory of a better man than me. I failed to see. I'm sorry. The apology hung in the air, raw and sincere. He had not offered excuses or justifications. He had simply owned his failure. For the first time, Evelyn Reed turned and looked directly at him. Her eyes were not angry or triumphant. They were clear, calm, and appraising. She saw the genuine remorse in his face. She gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Focus on the fundamentals, Staff Sergeant," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Ego is a phantom sight. It makes you miss the real target. The only thing that matters is a clean shot." It was not forgiveness, but it was something more valuable, a professional course correction. It was a chance at redemption. She turned back to the rifle, her lesson delivered. Later that week, a work crew arrived at Range 7. They installed a small, simple brass plaque on the concrete block of the final firing position. It read, "The Thornreed Line. Competence is the only rank that matters." Colonel Bishop himself had ordered it, cementing the lesson of that day into the very foundation of his command. The legend now had a physical shrine, a permanent reminder that true authority is not claimed with a loud voice, but proven with a quiet shot. A year passed. The sun and sand of the desert worked on the new brass plaque, softening its shine to a dull, respectable gleam. The story of what happened on that windy afternoon had passed from fresh gossip to established folklore, a foundational myth for every new class that passed through the Fort Ellison sniper course. A new group of recruits, their faces a mixture of nervous excitement and apprehension, now lay on the shooting mats of Range 7. Their instructor, a seasoned sergeant first class who had witnessed the event firsthand, gathered them around the final firing position before their first attempt at the gauntlet. He tapped the plaque with his finger. "Before you fire a single shot on this line," he began, his voice serious, "you need to know the story of this place. This is the Thornreed Line." He told them the story. He told them about the legendary Marcus Thorne and his decade-old record. He told them about the arrogant young instructor. And he didn't spare himself or his colleagues in the telling, admitting their collective failure to see. And he told them about the quiet, gray-haired master sergeant who had come to observe. He described the wind, the insults, the stunned silence, and the 5 perfect shots that rewrote history. "She never raised her voice," the instructor said, his eyes scanning the faces of the young soldiers. "She never boasted. She never listed her accomplishments. She let her rifle do the talking. She taught us all a lesson that day, one that's more important than anything you'll learn about windage or elevation. Before you open your mouth to judge someone, before you assume you know who they are or what they're capable of based on their age, their gender, their rank, or the patch on their sleeve, you remember this line. You remember that the most dangerous person on any battlefield is often the one you overlook. You remember that competence is quiet. The training at the sniper school had changed. There was a new, unofficial module in the curriculum, taught by every instructor, professional humility. The story of the ghost of Range 7 was now Lesson 1. Far away, on a different range in a different country, Master Sergeant Evelyn Reed lay on a shooting mat, the rifle Eleanor resting comfortably on its bipod in front of her. Beside her was a young female sharpshooter, a promising operator from a foreign special forces unit she was mentoring. Reed was watching the wind, her eyes calm, her voice patient as she talked the young soldier through the complex calculations for a high-angle shot in a mountainous environment. She was passing it on, not just the knowledge of ballistics and steel, but the philosophy of silence, the religion of competence, the profound and enduring legacy of the quiet professional. The plaque on Range 7 bore her name, but her true legacy wasn't etched in brass. It was being written in the skill of the next generation, in the quiet confidence of the students she taught, a legacy that would continue to move, unseen and unheard, across the most dangerous landscapes in the world. A true professional's worth is not measured in the medals pinned to a chest, for those are merely echoes of past actions. It is measured in the calm that resides in the heart during the storm, the quiet confidence that needs no announcement. It is not found in the stories one tells about oneself, but in the legends that others whisper after one has left the room. Legacy is not a monument of stone built to demand remembrance. It is the foundation, laid silently and meticulously, upon which others can build. It is the knowledge passed on, the standard upheld, the example set. The quiet competence of a warrior like Evelyn Reed is a moral force. It is a rebuke to the loud, the arrogant, and the superficial. It is a testament to the idea that substance will always, eventually, triumph over style. The clean, perfect shot is more than a physical act. It is a metaphor for moral clarity. It is the result of stripping away all that is unnecessary, ego, fear, doubt, until only the fundamental truth of the action remains. There is no ambiguity in a perfect shot. There is only cause and effect, intention and result. This is the world the quiet professional inhabits. Respect is not a uniform one wears to command deference. Respect is a standard one embodies, compelling it from others through undeniable action. Respect is not a rank bestowed by an institution. Respect is an action, a gesture earned when skill transcends hierarchy. Respect is not a voice that shouts to be heard over the chaos. Respect is a result delivered in silence that renders all chaos irrelevant. The ripples of that day on Range 7 continue to spread, not because of the 5 shots, but because of the profound silence that followed them. A silence filled with revelation, with humility, and with a newly awakened understanding of the true nature of strength. It is a strength that doesn't need to posture or proclaim its power. It simply is. It is a strength that is proven not in the telling, but in the doing. It is the enduring, unassailable power of the quiet professional, a power that reshapes the world not with noise, but with precision. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption, and where silent professionalism defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.